I'm joined today by Alice Dreger, historian of sexuality and author of Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice. The book is so interesting, and it deals with, of course, science and research. It deals with history. It deals with bias, both political and within the science world. Tell me sort of generally what led you to become interested in these areas.
Sure. Thanks for having me, David. Basically, I had been a patient rights activist for people with intersex. That's when people are born not with the standard male type or the standard female type anatomy, but something in between. And after years of doing that work, I started doing work on a transgender controversy within the sciences. And a group of transgender activists actually came after me, which was a little disorienting because I had been doing LGBT rights work. And after they came after me, I started realizing the extent to which researchers are in danger because if they dare to say something that offends a political identity group, they can be set upon by mobs and attacked and actually have their work really undermined. So I started setting out across the country talking to different researchers about what had happened to them. And these are typically people who are left of center, but who had the experience of leftist groups coming after them.
And we've been sort of dealing with this in a number of different ways. We've been talking about censorship on campus. We've been talking about sort of so-called progressives sometimes defending illiberal or not progressive principles, and we've sort of gone at it from a couple of different ways, but you're coming at it from a very particular point of view, which includes college campuses, not only from the student side, but also from the research side. Talk to us a little bit, or maybe give us some examples of what types of work you saw sort of stifled either for political correctness reasons or for some other political reason.
Sure. So one example would be the work done by the anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon. He was very interested in trying to figure out what is the basis of human nature, and he was attacked by people who thought that he was basically saying that our natural state is to be violent and drug using and abusing of women, which to some extent he was saying, but he had the American Anthropological Association do a 2-year prosecution basically of him that I show in the book was really false, that they knew from the beginning that the charges made against him weren't true, but they decided to hold it up as an example of proving that they cared about indigenous people, so they had to attack Chagnon for his ideas. In addition, I look at what happened with Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer, who were two researchers who looked at the biological bases for sexual coercion, including rape. They were challenging the classic feminist ideal that rape is primarily about power, not about sex. And they were trying to show that, in fact, sometimes it is about sex. And they were doing that in order to try to help prosecute rape, prevent rape, help rape victims, not because they were pro-rape in any way, but they were set upon by lots of mobs. I looked at Chuck Roselli, who was interested in the question of why some sheep, male sheep, only want to have sex with other male sheep, and he was set upon by LGBT activists as well as PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, which is an animal rights group. Elizabeth Loftus, who looked at childhood sexual abuse and the way that sometimes memories are actually implanted in kids, not actually recovered. And she was set upon by various people who insisted that no, recovered memory syndrome is always real. So basically, I was trying to trace out what happened to all these people because the ideas they put forward were challenging, which is really why the book is called Galileo's Middle Finger, because it's the idea of the researcher pushing against a common dogma, even when they are at risk personally for doing so.
And in researching you, I mean, of course, everybody has personal biases and motivations for whatever they do, but in some of these cases, you were sort of defending research that maybe in some ways, or at least superficially, might have been seen as going against your own values, right? I mean, with the example, from my understanding in researching and preparing for this interview, you consider yourself a feminist, but you were against some of the feminist censorship of that research into sexual violence because it was the principle of it, if I understand correctly.
Absolutely. And that's where I come down in the book is the idea that whatever our political points of view are, at the end of the day, where we have to really come together is the idea that we should look for truth in the world, that we should look for reality, and that sometimes science is going to tell us stuff we don't want to hear. That's actually how we know it's working, when it tells us stuff we don't want to hear. And so in the book, really, I come down on the side of saying, you know, I'm still a feminist. I'm still somebody who does LGBT rights activism, et cetera, But at the end of the day, I think we have to face facts. The reason being, we cannot have sustainable social policy if we're not reality based. And much as we might want to believe that, for example, rape is about power and it isn't about sex, if it is about sex, then we need to know that in order to deal with rape. So I very much come down on the side of believing that freedom of research, freedom of speech, freedom to inquire where you need to go is where we have to go to be a healthy democracy. And it really bothers me that a lot of liberals on campuses think the solution to discomfort is to shut people down. I think the solution to discomfort is to have more of it.
So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about sort of finding balance between a couple of positions that sometimes are problematic. You know, sometimes we hear the sort of defense of asking leading or unsubstantiated questions or furthering ideas that we've already done a lot of research into by saying, hey, I'm just asking questions. We should all be allowed to ask questions. So I'm sort of aware of the way in which I'm just asking questions can be misused. At the same time, the name is escaping me, but I'm guessing you remember this incident where someone at Harvard said something about exploring whether there is something inherent to women or men being better or worse in certain fields, and women in math was mentioned. Does this ring a bell to you?
Larry Summers, the president of Harvard.
Larry Summers, exactly. Okay. I thought that there was a really interesting sort of debate there because if it were true that there were some biological basis for women being not as good at math or men being not as good at something else, it would be really important for us to know that in thinking about our culture and society. Now, if that has already been studied front and back and there is absolutely nothing to explore there, I could see how bringing it up could be something worthy of criticism. But wouldn't some of these questions be questions we should have answered?
Yeah, I think sex difference questions are really important. And what the problem is when people think that when you're describing an average difference, that somehow you're concluding that everybody is different in that way. So sex differences, we know, are actually average differences, and that some people will be on opposite sides. Also, we know that developmentally, you can actually change somebody's outcome in terms of being able, for example, to improve math skills in particular ways. And actually, that's part of the reason why sex difference research is valuable, because one of the things it can show us is that, for example, girls may not learn math as well in a system that's been designed for boys, but that if you explain math to them in a particular way that addresses more perhaps the way that they're seeing the world, the way they're being treated in the world, they may actually excel at math quite a lot. And so sex difference research can actually help us understand how to do better teaching for all the populations. One of the things we find, for example, is that boys tend to have more narrow interests in terms of where they are in the world. So how do we help boys explore more broad interests, for example? If we deny that there is a sex difference there, then we're not able to begin to address how we can make life better for people, how we can make more people go into the sciences, go into the maths. So I think there's a really good reason to study that kind of stuff, and we don't need to be afraid of it. Just because science tells us that something exists in the world doesn't mean that's the way it has to be. Certainly science tells us, for example, that infanticide has been common historically in terms of taking care of your enemy's children. Murdering them has been common, historically speaking. But that doesn't mean we have to live that way, right? We can say to ourselves, in a civilized society, we don't target civilians. And we're capable of that kind of change. So I don't think we have to be afraid of science telling us things as much as people have thought we have to.
So, point taken, absolutely. These are hugely important areas of research. Now, the question I have is, how can we balance that with those who want to go further and say, well, if we did find that out in the research, then we should actually take a path that is more divisive than productive. The idea that we shouldn't care if we aren't seeing enough or the number of women that we would expect in a particular field, for example, because oftentimes valuable research, and there's no doubt that you're talking about valuable research and questions that we should be asking, is misused in a way that is hugely destructive. So how can we prevent that from happening?
I think that's part of what academics should be studying and evidencing, is the way that that kind of stuff gets misinterpreted and misused in ways that are ultimately harmful. You know, it is true, we all do have biases in our work. And that's part of the reason why diversity within research is really important, because people coming from different points of view have the potential to see different blind spots, see different ideas, have potential for different metaphors to be brought to bear that then help you figure out what new questions to ask, where you might look for the answers. So really, when you have something like what we find is that there are particular kinds of sex differences, maybe in terms of, for example, spatial relations. That doesn't tell us then that we should not have men and women read maps, right? What it does tell us is that we may read maps differently and that we have an ability to sort of grow that idea and figure out ways to all succeed in the world. And I think anybody who takes differences that are on average and assumes, therefore, you can apply them individually is just somebody who doesn't understand the research and needs a better education.
Can you talk a little bit in the last few minutes we have about the sort of different pressures that are impacting issues of free speech on campus and sort of the search for truth within what we consider to be a democratic system? You know, I get emails from people who say that it's primarily economic pressures that are really impacting many of these issues. Others say, you know, it's really political correctness. It's not so much an issue of money. Can you shed some light onto that?
So we've talked a little bit about the progressive problems, but I think it's very serious that we see in states where Republicans are in power that they're actively shutting down university units that do interesting work in political areas that they don't want to hear. So, for example, at the University of North Carolina, Gene Nichols' Center on Poverty was shut down by the state legislature, essentially, because he dared to look into the ways in which governmental policies led to greater poverty problems. So we do see governmental pressure in ways that are very dangerous, I think, in terms of interference. The other thing we do have is the economic pressures, and that includes reduction of national research funding. National research funding allows people to do work without having to take corporate money, and corporate money, we know, tends to skew results. And so we get better science, frankly, out of national funding, and that's been crunched. But then in addition to that, we see problems like I had at Northwestern, where universities become obsessed with branding. And when they become obsessed with branding, any kind of dangerous idea that's out there that might upset somebody is something that's squashed down, both in terms of teaching, writing, research. And I saw that in my own case where my work was censorship because I was talking about sex and disability. So those are all the kinds of pressures that exist. I mean, there are others as well, but they're major pressures now. And I think it's really important for academics to take seriously their duty to other people in our democracy and work really hard on protecting academic freedom and free speech so that we can continue to have debates, disagreements, arguments in which we progress forward.
We've been speaking with Alice Dreger, historian of sexuality, author of Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice. Super interesting book and just a really important topic. Thanks so much for talking to me about it.
Thanks, David.